back to my painting desk. If you're anything like me, then you're constantly on the lookout for inspiration when it comes to miniature painting, be it in the pages of a White Dwarf magazine, doom scrolling on social media, or just having a good old-fashioned daydream. But in one of my recent painting sessions, something else caught my attention as I was listening to an interview the Warhammer conference conducted with the great John Blanche.
Anyway, but I started to develop my own techniques, which were a lot mainly inspired by Rembrandt, funny enough.
After hearing this, there was only one question on my mind. Who was Rembrandt? Okay, let's do this quickly. Rembrandt Harmenzoon van Rijn was born in Leiden in the Netherlands in 1606. He had a fairly slow start to his art career, but then he moved to Amsterdam. He moved to Amsterdam just at the time of the Reformation when the Protestant Church came into power. The Protestant Church were commissioning a lot less religious pieces of art than the Catholic Church were, so as consequences, artists had to concentrate on commissions from private individuals. Rembrandt quickly began to make a name for himself as a painter of historical subjects. He also chose to follow a different path to most young artists at the time, who were mainly going off to Italy. He believed he could learn everything he needed to know in his native country. He moved back to Leiden for a bit, but then in 1631 he moved back to Amsterdam and began a family. His art career went from strength to strength as important families commissioned historical paintings such as Balthazar's Feast and the Night's Watch. However, Rembrandt had a big spending habit and he was a compulsive buyer of art and antiquities. Unfortunately, after the death of his wife, economic depression and spending habits, Rembrandt became bankrupt and ended his life in poverty. It was in the latter half of this year that he produced the most of his portraits that he's famous for. Now, this backstory is all great, but it doesn't help us figure out how Rembrandt would paint Warhammer. It does, however, seem like he would have a massive pile of shame and addiction to buying plastic like we do too. What we really need to ask was actually foreshadowed by the YouTube search bar 20 seconds ago. What is Rembrandt lighting? Okay, back for another quick explanation. Remember when I said that Rembrandt hadn't gone to Italy? This didn't stop him becoming inspired by Italian artists. As prints made their way to Amsterdam and his contemporaries began to use techniques favoured by Italian artists. The most prominent in Rembrandt's work, and the one we'll be diving into in this video, is a dramatic use of lighting developed by Caravaggio. Chiaroscuro, hope I said that right, is a technique in visual arts that uses strong contrast between light and dark to create a sense of depth and volume. It literally translates to light and dark in Italian. The influence of Caravaggio is evident in Rembrandt's work from the 1630s. He developed a new way of describing faces with patterns of light and shadow, rather than simply lighting one side of the face and shading the other. Shadows around the eyes of his portraits, making it hard to read a precise expression, gives his canvases the extraordinary impression of the living, thinking mind behind the face. Okay, so we've established the basics of Rembrandt, but I don't think online learning is going to be enough to paint a mini. I think if we really want to figure out how to do it, I'm going to go out to see him in person myself. So let's go. Trip to the National Gallery on the weekend. I honestly was just blown away by all the art, not just Rembrandt stuff. I think painting minis and just painting in general has now given me a new appreciation for this old art and technique. I got to see loads of Rembrandts, and the thing that really was obvious when seeing him was his palette. This arguably is what Rembrandt is best known for, apart from his lighting as well, and it's actually what John Blanche was mainly referring to when he said he was inspired by him, as they use a lot of the same colours. The first thing to decide on was a model. As the model itself would make a huge impact on the final effect of the piece and on my confidence approaching the project, it had to be something that I felt like it came from a Rembrandt painting, and there was only one model that jumped to mind: the Empire Witch Hunter. He was perfect, and I luckily had this idea and purchased him in a very short window he restocked on the Games Workshop website. And I managed to snag this guy for £9, which is just unheard of. I actually couldn't believe it in this day and age. In past videos I've moaned a lot about the prices of Games Workshop stuff, but this was a bargain. The final purchase I needed to make was one of these backdrop plinths. I wanted the mini to feel as if part of a painting, and this seemed like the easiest way to do so. I really recommend these plinths from Tarot Model Makers. I met them at MPO Bristol and I bought a few of their plinths since. They're really affordable, this isn't sponsored, but they're just a good product. To finish assembly, I made a sort of cobbled street base and stuck down the mini. In many cases, I would have painted him off the base, but as I explained earlier, I wanted everything to be painted as one painting. The final step before the painting began was to take some referenced light photos that I could help to place my highlights. As I had these coming from the left of the model, there'd be a starker transition between light and shadow. With our canvas prepped, it was time to choose some paints, and I initially wanted to paint this whole model using oil paints, as that's what Rembrandt would have used, but I quickly found on a test model that I definitely don't have enough experience with this technique yet, and it would have just led to a messy finish. So I chose to go for the traditional acrylic route that we normally use for mini painting. Rembrandt's palette is made up of browns, umbers, ochres, and he uses these, as I read somewhere online, to create strategic highlights. This allowed him to get that light-dark contrast we spoke about earlier, and this is where we make the jump to miniature painting. I wanted to know how I would fare under the constraints of a limited palette, and I wanted to see if I could get that bright, glowing look using those strategic highlights. I had a great time painting this model, and it's maybe the most fun I've had painting a mini yet. I began sketching in my highlights and shadows. Using reference images we took earlier, I followed the reflections of the light and used my brightest highlights along these parts of the model. This was typically an ivory or a bright orange umber colour. My shadows I started just filling in with a big brush using Doomball Brown. I also began to add some blues into my shadows as well. This cooler colour would contrast with the rest of the warm colours on the model, and I think it just added a little extra interest. While Rembrandt didn't really use blue like this much, he did use some blue in some of his paintings, and so I think we can get away with using it here too. With our highlights and shadows sketched in, we now need to start blending these two together with our midtones. Now I didn't want to achieve a super smooth blend here, as I wanted to keep that brushstroke texture you find on paintings, and also if I'm honest, I didn't want to spend 20 hours on this model. One find I think challenging, especially when copying from reference, is trying to figure out the exact colours that the artists use. I don't know if this sounds stupid, but as a heads up, I am slightly colourblind, but I find it really hard sometimes to look at a model and see exactly what's in the shadow or what exact tone of colour that is they've used on the skin or things like that. And one way I found to overcome this is actually by using Photoshop or the colour dropper tool on any program like Canva or anything like that. Using a tool like this allows us to take a painting like the Night's Watch, as this was the main colour inspiration for this mini. And looking at the image, I can see there's browns, ivories, cream tones, skin tones, but these colours don't have labels like Mornfang Brown or even Orange Red Brown, so choosing which colour to use can be difficult. To overcome this, and to help me analyse reference photos more deeply, I use the colour dropper tool, and you can do this on any software, and I just select a bit of the colour, and then it shows me in the kind of colour combo thing where it's made in the top right corner here. It shows me where it is on the scale, what type of mix of colours it is, how much white or grey, how desaturated or saturated it is, how bright or dark it is as well. And I kind of feel like this is like training for my eyes, and using this method I would simply find part of the painting I liked or wanted to recreate and select the colour, see where it fell on the colour map, and then use my colours to mix something up close to it. If I knew it was a yellowy brown, I could then mix that amount of each colour until I got something close. I think this is a really good way to get thinking out of the predetermined colours we buy, and just makes it feel a little less daunting when trying to mix our own colours. The final thing to do at this point was to paint all the details, and these I left purposely vague and scratchy. I used my black and white alongside yellows and browns to do a really rough NMM and add some variants to the leather parts on the model to differentiate it from the cloak. I really didn't go into too much details in these parts, as I wanted the focus to be drawn to the brightest areas of the model, his cloak, and of course his face. A final thing to point out with the face is Rembrandt often painted his subjects with a slight shadow over their face. A look I tried to recreate under the brimmed hat of this witch hunter, pushing the highlights quite high on certain spots on the nose and cheek and leaving everything around the eye much less defined and vague. The final step in this first stage of painting was to paint the background and base. I chose to keep my palette here super limited and used a few browns, ivory and a little ice yellow, and just began stippling on the paint, starting with the darkest colour and working my way to the lighter areas, concentrating the paint towards the centre of my backdrop as it got brighter. I tried to build up some texture in the backdrop using this method, and over several coats and working back and forth, I was able to get a smooth blend I was happy with. When it came to the base, I just used the same palette and wet blended in the same rough shallows and highlights, before dry brushing a couple of the edges of the bricks to highlight them. This was a super quick process, but the final result I think is very effective, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. At this point I was feeling pretty happy with the progress on the model. I knew he was nearly done, so I sent the model to some friends to get some feedback, and the main thing that came back was that the model blended in a little bit too much with the background. To overcome this, I decided to darken the background and just push a few highlights around the face to draw the interest there. And this actually made a lot of sense because when I went to the National Gallery, in Rembrandt's paintings, a lot of his portraits were very, very dark, and I think this allowed that contrast and to make the people seem like they were glowing and coming out of the painting, and really draws your eye to the subject rather than anything in the background. Toning down the backdrop was even easier than painting it. I just mixed up a black-brown oil wash and began to apply it generously over the surface. I found that if I applied it at the top and let it run down the backdrop, I was left with this really interesting pattern that added more depth and atmosphere to the model, making him feel like he's in a dark, wet part of the world. To make sure they both felt like the same painting, the base got the same treatment too. To finish up this Rembrandt-inspired paint job, I simply added some ivory or ice yellow to the previous highlights that we had on the model, and also added some edge highlighting to help separate certain objects and areas. Finally, I glazed a brighter ochre yellow colour over some of the highlights of the cloak, as I thought they weren't quite matching the warmth of Rembrandt's work. And with that, the model was finished. This guy was quite hard to take video and take photos of. There was something about the background the camera was finding hard to separate, so I hope these photos and maybe a bad video if I have one will do. Overall, I'm really pleased with how this guide turned out. It was a really fun idea and I'm really glad I decided to run with it. I think the atmosphere and the highlight placement really worked. It's not perfect, but I really just want to keep pushing this idea of contrast in my minis to make them look bright and glowing, and this was a really fun test to do so. I think I used the limited palette well, and overall just the atmosphere and the mood of the model is what I was hoping for. So I'm really happy with this test, and it was a really fun process to do. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. I really enjoyed this format of researching an old artist and trying to copy their style. So if you liked it too, then please let me know in the comments, because I'm thinking maybe I could do some more in the future. Maybe look at Impressionism and Monet, or Abstractionism and Picasso, and any sort of artists like that, and maybe some that don't really seem to fit mini painting as much as Rembrandt did, and just see what we can create. But yeah, that's the end of the video. So if you enjoyed, then please like and subscribe. Comment down below if you have any ideas for future artists, and I hope that the next time you sit at your painting desk, you have a great time painting, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.